Most people pray their entire lives and wonder why nothing changes. They beg, they plead, they repeat the same words over and over, yet their problems remain exactly the same, or even get worse. Joel Goldsmith discovered something that transformed prayer from desperate pleading into a power that actually works in the real world. This isn't about praying harder or longer or using special religious words. It's about understanding what prayer truly is and what it absolutely is not. The secret lies in recognizing that effective prayer has nothing to do with asking God to change anything in your life or in the world. God's nature is already perfect, complete, and unchanging in every moment. When you pray with requests and petitions, you're operating from the fundamental belief that something is wrong or missing in God's creation. You're actually affirming and reinforcing the very problem you want solved, giving it more power in your consciousness. True prayer, as Joel taught through decades of mystical experience, is the practice of recognition rather than petition. It's recognizing that the divine perfection already exists right where the problem seems to be appearing in your life. You're not trying to make something happen or convince God to act on your behalf. You're opening your consciousness to see and experience what is already eternally true in spiritual reality, beyond all appearances. This single shift in understanding changes everything about how prayer works in your life and why most prayers seem to fail. When you stop asking and start recognizing, when you stop begging and start knowing, prayer becomes the most powerful force in your experience. This is what Joel called the secret of secrets in spiritual life. Joel Goldsmith called this recognition prayer, and it operates on a completely different principle than what most churches and religious traditions teach their followers. Instead of telling God what you need or explaining your problems to the divine, you're reminding yourself of what God already is in this eternal moment. You're aligning your consciousness with spiritual truth rather than reinforcing the appearance of lack, sickness, discord, or any form of limitation. When you pray asking God to heal someone, you're secretly affirming that they're sick and that God hasn't already provided wholeness and perfection for them. You're working against yourself without even realizing it. Recognition prayer starts from the understanding that God's perfection is already present in that person. Your role is simply to recognize it, to become conscious of it, to let that awareness fill your mind until it becomes your living experience. This isn't positive thinking or denying what you see with your physical eyes and senses. It's a spiritual realization that there's a deeper reality than physical appearances, a truth that exists beyond what your senses report. Just as darkness disappears the instant you turn on a light without any fight or struggle, problems dissolve when you recognize the truth of God's presence. The light doesn't fight the darkness or argue with it. It simply reveals what was always there beneath the appearance. Understanding this principle is the foundation of everything Joel taught about prayer. Most people never discover it because they're taught from childhood that prayer means asking God for things. They're taught that God needs to be convinced, persuaded, or pleased before help will come. This fundamental misunderstanding keeps prayer powerless in their lives for decades. Here's how Joel practiced recognition prayer in real situations that seemed impossible to human eyes. A woman came to him absolutely desperate because her husband had abandoned her and their children with no explanation and no financial support. She wanted Joel to pray that her husband would return and that everything would be restored. Instead of doing what she asked, Joel went into silent recognition. He didn't ask God to change the husband or fix the situation or make anything happen. He recognized that God is the only presence and power operating in that entire situation. He recognized that divine love is already functioning perfectly in that family. He didn't affirm the appearance of separation, abandonment, or lack. He simply rested in the truth that spiritual wholeness was already established as eternal fact. Within days, the husband returned home completely transformed, with no external intervention that anyone could identify. This wasn't manipulation or mind control or any form of mental influence over another person. Recognition prayer doesn't try to change anyone or anything in the external world. It simply clears your consciousness of false beliefs so that spiritual reality can express itself naturally in your experience. When you stop energizing the problem with your thoughts, fears, and constant attention, the solution that was always present can emerge into your visible world. The woman was amazed and called it a miracle, but Joel explained that it wasn't a miracle at all. It was simply the natural result of consciousness recognizing truth instead of accepting and empowering appearances. This is how recognition prayer works in every situation when you understand and practice it correctly. The practice is simpler than you think, though it requires a complete shift in your entire approach to prayer and spirituality. When a problem arises in your life, instead of immediately asking God to fix it or change it, you pause and turn within. You go to that quiet space of spiritual awareness that exists beneath all your thoughts and emotions. You might say silently to yourself, God is the only presence here in this situation. God is the only power actually operating in this moment. You're not trying to convince God of anything or persuade the divine to help you. You're reminding your own consciousness of spiritual truth that already exists. You might recognize that divine intelligence is already functioning perfectly in this situation. That infinite love is already governing every detail and every person involved. That wholeness is the only reality that actually exists. You rest in this recognition until you feel a sense of peace, release, or inner knowing. This takes practice, especially at first when your mind is trained to worry and problem solve. Your human mind wants to jump back into anxiety, planning, and trying to figure out solutions. That's completely normal and expected. Simply return to recognition each time you notice your mind wandering. Over weeks and months of consistent practice, this becomes your natural response to any challenge that appears. The transformation isn't just in your circumstances, though those will change. The deeper transformation is in your entire relationship with prayer, with God, and with spiritual truth itself. You stop being a beggar asking for help and become someone who knows truth and rests in that knowing regardless of appearances. A man named Robert had suffered from chronic anxiety for over 20 years of his adult life. He'd tried everything available: therapy, medication, meditation apps, every self-help technique and spiritual practice he could find. Nothing provided lasting relief from the constant worry and fear. When he discovered Joel's teaching on recognition prayer, he was deeply skeptical, but desperate enough to try anything at that point. He committed to practicing it every morning for 15 minutes before starting his day. For the first 2 weeks, nothing seemed to change at all in his experience. His anxiety was still there, sometimes even worse because he was paying more attention to his mental and emotional state. But he persisted with the practice because something about Joel's teaching resonated with him. He would sit quietly and recognize that God is the only presence, that divine peace is his true nature beneath all appearances. He wasn't asking to be healed or begging for relief. He was recognizing that in spiritual truth, there was nothing to heal. By the 3rd week, something began to shift in subtle ways. He noticed moments during the day when the anxiety simply wasn't there, not because he fought it or used a technique to manage it, but because his consciousness was resting more naturally in spiritual truth. These moments became longer and more frequent as he continued the practice. After 3 months of daily recognition prayer, the anxiety that had dominated his entire life for 20 years had dissolved completely. Not through struggle, not through fighting or managing symptoms, but through recognition of what was already true. He still practices recognition daily, not to maintain the healing, but because he's discovered the joy of resting in spiritual truth. Sarah was facing financial crisis that seemed to have no solution in the physical world. Her business was failing rapidly, creditors were calling multiple times every day, and she saw absolutely no way out of the situation. A friend introduced her to Joel's teaching on recognition prayer during this desperate time. At first it seemed too simple, too impractical, almost ridiculous. How could recognizing God's abundance possibly pay her bills or save her failing business? Every time fear about money arose in her consciousness, instead of spiraling into panic and worst-case scenarios, she would pause and recognize that divine supply is already established as eternal truth, not as a way to get money or manipulate circumstances, but as a spiritual truth that exists regardless of appearances. She recognized that infinite abundance is God's nature, and therefore it must be the truth of her own being since she exists in God. She didn't see how this could possibly help her practical situation, but she practiced it anyway. Within 6 weeks, unexpected opportunities began appearing in ways she couldn't have planned or predicted. A former client she hadn't heard from in 2 years reached out with a major contract that was perfect for her skills. Someone she hadn't spoken to in years called and offered a business partnership that opened completely new possibilities. These weren't random coincidences in a lucky universe. They were the natural outflow of her changed consciousness. By the 4th month, not only was her business stable and all creditors paid, it was thriving beyond anything she'd experienced even before the crisis began. The recognition prayer hadn't magically created money. It had changed her consciousness, and that changed consciousness naturally attracted opportunities and solutions that had always existed but couldn't reach her through her consciousness of lack and fear. James discovered recognition prayer when his marriage was falling apart after 15 years together. Years of accumulated conflict, resentment, and misunderstanding had created so much damage that divorce seemed not just likely but inevitable to everyone who knew them. Traditional marriage counseling hadn't helped at all. Prayer, where he asked God to change his wife or fix the relationship, had only made things worse because it reinforced his belief that she was the problem that needed fixing. When he learned to practice recognition through Joel's teaching, everything shifted in his approach. He stopped trying to change her or fix the marriage. Instead, he would sit in silence and recognize that divine love is the only presence in his marriage. That God's harmony is already established in their relationship is spiritual fact. He wasn't denying the conflict he could see and feel every day. He was recognizing a deeper spiritual truth that existed beneath the appearances of discord. The change was gradual but absolutely profound in its effects. Over several months, as his consciousness shifted from judgment and resentment to recognition of truth, his wife began responding differently to him. Not because he manipulated her or because she knew what he was doing spiritually, but because his own consciousness was no longer feeding the conflict with negative energy and judgment. Today, 5 years later, they have a stronger, more loving marriage than they ever imagined possible during those dark months. The transformation came entirely through recognition, rather than through trying to fix anyone or anything. James says his daily recognition practice is now the foundation of not just his marriage but his entire life. What all these transformation stories reveal is a fundamental truth about how recognition prayer actually works in your life. It works by changing your consciousness, not by changing God or convincing God to act on your behalf. God's perfection is already established in every situation. The problem is never in spiritual reality or in what God is or isn't doing. The problem is always in our false beliefs, our acceptance of appearances as ultimate truth, our complete forgetting of what God actually is. When you practice recognition consistently over time, you're training your consciousness to rest in spiritual truth rather than being hypnotized and controlled by circumstances. This isn't denying reality or pretending problems don't exist. It's recognizing a deeper reality that exists beneath surface appearances. Physical appearances are real as appearances, but they're not the ultimate truth about any situation. The ultimate truth is always that God is the only presence and power actually operating. Each of these people practiced recognition for weeks or months before seeing major changes. This is realistic and important to understand. Recognition prayer isn't a magic formula that instantly changes everything. It's a practice that gradually transforms your consciousness, and that transformed consciousness then naturally changes your experience. Be patient with yourself and with the practice. If these real transformation stories inspire you to discover effective prayer for yourself, like this video right now to help others find Joel Goldsmith's revolutionary teachings. Subscribe for more mystical Christian wisdom that actually works in daily life. And comment which transformation story resonated most deeply with your own spiritual journey. Now let's explore the complementary practices that enhance and deepen recognition prayer in your daily life. Joel taught that silence is absolutely essential to this practice, not just quiet on the outside where you're not talking or hearing noise, but inner silence where you're not mentally chattering, planning, worrying, or rehearsing conversations. This silent receptivity creates the space where spiritual recognition can occur naturally in your consciousness without mental interference. Most people find this inner silence extremely difficult at first because the mind has been trained for years to stay constantly busy. Your mind wants to stay occupied with thoughts and concerns every waking moment. That's why Joel recommended starting with just 5 minutes of silence daily, then gradually increasing. Sit comfortably, close your eyes, and simply be still inside and out. When thoughts arise, and they will constantly at first, don't fight them or judge yourself. Gently return your attention to the awareness of presence, to that sense of God's being. Over time, with consistent practice, this inner silence becomes easier and more natural to access. You'll find yourself able to drop into it instantly during your day, even in the middle of challenging or chaotic situations. This silence isn't emptiness or blankness. It's full of divine presence, full of spiritual reality. It's in this silence that recognition happens most powerfully, where spiritual truth reveals itself directly to your consciousness without words or concepts. Joel practiced this silence for hours daily throughout his life. He said it was the foundation of everything else in his spiritual work. Even if you can only manage 5 or 10 minutes initially, that's enough to begin experiencing the power of inner silence combined with recognition of spiritual truth. Another complementary practice that transforms everything is what Joel called living by grace instead of living by law or personal effort. This means recognizing that you don't earn spiritual good through your worthiness, your efforts, your prayers, or your spiritual practices. Grace is God's nature expressing itself freely without conditions. When you stop trying to deserve healing, abundance, harmony, or any spiritual good, and simply recognize that grace is already flowing in your life, everything changes in your experience. Living by grace transforms how you approach your entire day and every activity. Instead of striving and struggling to make things happen through personal willpower, you recognize that divine intelligence is already operating in everything you do. You still do your human tasks and fulfill your responsibilities, yes, but from a consciousness of cooperation with grace rather than personal effort alone. This doesn't make you passive or lazy. It makes you powerfully effective because you're working with divine power rather than against it. Practice this by starting each morning with the recognition that grace is already established in your day as spiritual fact, not as a wish or hope or something you're trying to create, but as truth that already exists. Then move through your activities with that awareness active in your consciousness. Notice how differently you feel when you're cooperating with grace rather than trying to force outcomes through willpower and struggle alone. Joel said that living by grace was one of the most difficult principles for people to grasp because we're so trained to believe that we must earn everything through effort and struggle. But grace is already flowing. Your role is simply to recognize it and cooperate with it, not to create it or earn it through spiritual worthiness. Joel also taught the absolutely critical importance of recognizing one power rather than accepting the appearance of opposing powers. Most people unconsciously believe in two powers throughout their entire lives: God as good and some opposing force like evil, sickness, lack, or human will that resists God. This belief in two powers is what makes problems seem so real, so powerful, and so difficult to overcome. Recognition prayer dissolves this false belief by acknowledging that God is the only power actually operating in any situation. When you face a challenge or problem, instead of seeing it as a power opposing you or opposing God, recognize it as a false appearance that has no actual power behind it. It may seem absolutely real to your physical senses and logical mind, but spiritual truth reveals only one power exists. This isn't denying what you see or pretending the appearance doesn't exist. It's recognizing that what you see doesn't have the power you've been giving it through your belief and attention. Practice recognizing one power by catching yourself whenever you speak or think in terms of opposing forces or powers. Instead of saying this problem has power over me or this situation is controlling my life, recognize that only God is power. Instead of fighting against circumstances as if they were opposing forces, recognize their powerlessness in the face of spiritual truth. This shifts absolutely everything about how you experience challenges. This principle of one power was central to everything Joel taught. He said that as long as you believe in two powers, you'll constantly be fighting battles that can't be won. But when you recognize that God is the only power, all battles dissolve because there's nothing to fight against. There's only truth to recognize. The practice of non-judgment complements recognition prayer beautifully and powerfully. When you judge appearances as good or bad, right or wrong, you're reinforcing the belief that they're ultimately real and have power over your life. Joel taught that spiritual consciousness looks beyond appearances without judging them as final reality, recognizing instead the perfection that exists spiritually beneath all appearances. This doesn't mean you ignore practical concerns or pretend everything is wonderful when circumstances clearly appear difficult or painful. It means you don't give appearances the power of ultimate reality in your consciousness. You see the situation clearly with your physical eyes. You take appropriate practical action, but you don't accept the appearance as the final truth about what's actually happening spiritually. Start practicing non-judgment with small everyday things in your life. When something seems to go wrong, instead of immediately labeling it as bad or getting upset, pause and recognize that divine order is operating even if you can't see how yet. When someone acts in a way you don't like, instead of condemning them or their actions, recognize that God is the reality of their being beneath the appearance of their behavior. This practice trains your consciousness gradually to see beyond appearances to spiritual truth in every situation. It takes time and consistent practice because judgment is such a deeply ingrained human habit. But as you practice non-judgment combined with recognition, you'll find yourself living with much more peace and much less reactivity to circumstances. Let's address honestly the real challenges you'll face when practicing recognition prayer in your actual life. The biggest obstacle is the human mind's complete addiction to problem-solving and action. When you face a crisis or urgent situation, everything in you wants to immediately figure out solutions, make plans, take action, do something to fix the problem. Recognition prayer asks you to pause first, to establish your consciousness and spiritual truth before taking any action. This feels completely counterintuitive and even irresponsible at first. You might think, I don't have time to sit and meditate or recognize truth. I need to do something about this problem right now before it gets worse. But Joel discovered through decades of experience that action taken from a consciousness of spiritual recognition is far more effective than panicked activity from a consciousness of fear, worry, and limitation. The practice is to catch yourself in that moment of panic, urgency, or overwhelming worry. Take even just 60 seconds to pause and recognize that God is the only presence and power operating in this situation. Recognize that divine intelligence is already at work even if you can't see how. Then take whatever practical action seems appropriate or necessary, but from that foundation of spiritual recognition instead of from fear. Your actions will be wiser, more effective, and more aligned with actual solutions when they come from a consciousness resting in truth. This doesn't mean you become passive or avoid taking necessary action. It means your actions are guided by spiritual intelligence rather than driven by fear and desperation. Another major challenge that everyone faces is doubt about whether this practice actually works. You'll practice recognition prayer faithfully and think, this isn't working at all, nothing is changing. I'm just fooling myself with spiritual ideas while my problems remain exactly the same. This doubt is completely normal, predictable, and actually part of the process. Your human mind has been trained for decades to believe in the ultimate power of circumstances and appearances. Recognition prayer is literally retraining your consciousness to rest in a completely different reality, and that transformation takes time to become visible in your experience. Joel was absolutely clear about this with his students. He said you might practice faithfully for weeks or even months before you see tangible results in your circumstances. But something is definitely happening beneath the surface of your visible experience. Every single time you choose recognition over fear, every time you acknowledge spiritual truth instead of accepting appearances as final, you're changing your consciousness at a deep level. That's the real work that's happening. The changes in circumstances follow later as the natural result of your changed consciousness. But the consciousness must change first. When doubt arises, and it will repeatedly, don't fight it or feel like you're failing spiritually. Simply return to recognition without judgment. You might recognize that even the doubt itself is just another appearance with no real power over truth. You might recognize that God's perfection doesn't depend on whether you feel confident or doubtful about it. The truth remains eternally true regardless of how you feel about it. Just keep practicing. A subtle but important challenge is using recognition prayer as manipulation to get what you want. You might find yourself recognizing truth not to genuinely align with spiritual reality, but to try to make something specific happen that your human self desires. This turns recognition into another form of petitionary prayer, just with different, more spiritual-sounding words. Joel warned against this manipulation specifically and repeatedly. True recognition has absolutely no personal agenda attached to it. You're not trying to make anything happen in the external world. You're simply acknowledging what is already eternally true spiritually, regardless of what happens or doesn't happen in your circumstances. If you notice yourself thinking, "I'll recognize divine abundance so I can get that money I need for my bills," you've slipped into manipulation mode. The recognition is genuine and pure when you can rest in spiritual truth without needing it to produce specific outcomes that you've decided are necessary. This takes brutally honest self-examination. Practice recognizing truth for its own sake because it is true, not because of what you hope it will do for you or how you want circumstances to change. Paradoxically, when you completely release the personal agenda and rest in pure recognition of truth, that's often precisely when the transformation in your circumstances naturally occurs. But it comes as grace, as the natural expression of truth, not as a reward for performing the correct spiritual technique. This is a subtle but crucial distinction. The challenge of persistence and consistency is perhaps the most difficult of all over the long term. You'll practice recognition prayer consistently for a while, see some encouraging results, feel spiritually connected. Then life gets busy and you gradually forget. You slip back into old habitual patterns of worry, petition, and accepting appearances as final reality. This isn't failure or spiritual weakness. It's simply part of the very human process of transformation. The key is simply to begin again whenever you notice you've stopped practicing, without judgment or guilt about the gap. Joel practiced recognition prayer for decades until the day he died, and he said there were still times when his first automatic response to a problem was fear, concern, or worry. The difference was that he quickly caught himself and returned to recognition. That's all that's required from you. Not perfection in your practice, not never forgetting or never falling back into old patterns, but simply the willingness to keep choosing recognition over fear, truth over appearances, spiritual reality over human judgment. Each time you catch yourself and return to recognition, you're strengthening that pathway in your consciousness. Over time, it becomes more natural and automatic. If these practical insights about overcoming real challenges speak directly to your experience right now, like this video to support this teaching reaching others, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices that work in actual daily life, and comment which specific obstacle you're most ready to transform through recognition prayer starting today. Let's explore how recognition prayer works in advanced situations that seem far beyond simple personal problems. Michael was a physician who began practicing Joel's teaching while continuing his conventional medical practice. He didn't abandon medicine or medical science, but he brought spiritual recognition into his work with every single patient. Before seeing each patient, he would take a moment to sit quietly and recognize that God is the only presence, that spiritual wholeness is the eternal truth of this person's being beneath all appearances. He noticed something remarkable happening over months of this practice. Patients in his care recovered faster and more completely than statistical averages and medical predictions would suggest was possible. He wasn't practicing faith healing or refusing to use proper medicine and treatment. He was simply holding a consciousness of spiritual truth while providing excellent conventional medical care. The recognition created an atmosphere or spiritual environment where healing could occur more naturally. After 15 years of combining medical practice with recognition prayer, Michael says his entire relationship with illness and disease has fundamentally transformed. He sees physical symptoms not as ultimate reality, but as appearances that can and do change when consciousness recognizes and rests in spiritual truth. He still treats symptoms appropriately with medical science, but he no longer gives those symptoms the power of being the final word about a person's actual reality. His patients often comment that they feel different in his presence, more peaceful, more hopeful, though they can't explain why. He never tells them what he's doing spiritually. The healing atmosphere is simply the natural result of his consciousness resting in recognition of spiritual truth while he works. Linda applied recognition prayer to her challenging business leadership role in a large company. She managed a team of 40 people with constant conflicts, personality clashes, performance issues, and interpersonal drama. Traditional management techniques and leadership training helped somewhat, but the underlying tensions and problems remained persistent no matter what she tried. When she learned recognition prayer through Joel's books, She began practicing it before every meeting and interaction with her team. She would sit quietly in her office and recognize that divine intelligence is operating in her entire team. That harmony is the spiritual truth of their relationships beneath all the apparent discord. That God's perfection is present in every person, regardless of their current behavior or personality conflicts. She wasn't pretending problems didn't exist or avoiding addressing issues. She was recognizing a deeper truth while still handling practical management responsibilities appropriately. The transformation in her team's dynamics took about 8 months to become obviously visible to everyone. People who had been in constant conflict for years began cooperating naturally without her having to mediate constantly. Performance improved dramatically without her having to push, threaten, or motivate people through fear. Team meetings became productive instead of tension-filled battles. She didn't tell anyone what she was doing spiritually with recognition prayer. The change came simply from her consciousness holding recognition of spiritual truth while leading practically and competently. Today, 3 years later, her team consistently outperforms all other departments. She attributes the success entirely to recognition prayer creating an atmosphere where people's natural abilities can emerge. David faced a complex legal battle that threatened to destroy everything he'd built over 20 years of hard work. His lawyers reviewed the case thoroughly and said it looked very bad and he should prepare for the worst possible outcome. Instead of spending his days and nights in fear, anger, and desperate strategizing, he committed to consistent recognition prayer throughout the entire ordeal. Several times each day, he would stop whatever he was doing and recognize that divine justice is already established, that God's perfect order is operating in this entire situation. This was extremely difficult because the temptation to worry, rehearse arguments, and imagine worst-case scenarios was absolutely overwhelming at times. But he kept returning to recognition each time he noticed his mind spiraling into fear. He didn't neglect the practical legal work. He cooperated fully with his attorneys and provided everything they needed. But he refused to accept the appearance of injustice as the ultimate reality of the situation. He held the recognition that spiritual truth was present and operating even where appearances suggested otherwise. The legal battle lasted 18 difficult months. Throughout that entire time, David maintained his practice of recognition prayer, sometimes multiple times per hour when fear was particularly strong. The final outcome was far better than anyone involved expected or thought possible given the facts of the case. Key evidence appeared at the last moment from an unexpected source. The opposing side made strategic errors that weakened their position. His lawyers called the outcome miraculous and couldn't fully explain it legally. David knew it was simply the natural result of consciousness consistently resting in spiritual truth despite all appearances to the contrary. The most advanced application of recognition prayer is recognizing truth for world situations that seem completely hopeless. Joel taught that individual consciousness affects collective consciousness in ways we don't fully understand. When you practice recognition about world problems, war, injustice, violence, widespread suffering, you're not pretending these terrible things don't exist or minimizing human pain. You're recognizing that spiritual truth is present even there, even in the darkest situations. This practice feels almost impossible when you see terrible news or witness suffering in the world. Everything in your human nature wants to react with anger, fear, despair, or helpless hopelessness. But Joel discovered through his own practice that when he held recognition of God's presence as the only power operating even in seemingly terrible world situations, something shifted in consciousness. Not always in the outer circumstances immediately, but always in the spiritual atmosphere. You might recognize that divine love is the only power actually operating in areas of conflict and war. That spiritual wholeness is present even where suffering appears to dominate. You're not denying the human experience or pretending people aren't suffering. You're recognizing a deeper reality that exists spiritually beneath all appearances. And as more people practice this recognition for world situations, collective consciousness gradually shifts in ways that eventually do manifest as changes in the world. This is how spiritual truth eventually transforms not just individual lives, but entire societies and human civilization. It begins with individuals who understand recognition prayer and practice it faithfully. When you truly understand the secret of effective prayer through Joel Goldsmith's teaching, your entire life becomes a continuous practice of recognition. You no longer divide your experience into spiritual times when you pray and ordinary times when you deal with practical reality. Every single moment becomes an opportunity to recognize spiritual truth operating. Every challenge becomes an invitation to see beyond appearances to what is ultimately and eternally real. This doesn't mean you walk around in a spiritually spaced out state ignoring practical reality and responsibilities. Quite the opposite. You become more effective in the world, not less effective. You handle responsibilities more wisely and more efficiently because you're not operating from fear, limitation, and constant worry. You respond to situations from a consciousness that knows spiritual perfection is already established, even when circumstances suggest otherwise. Joel lived this way for decades of active teaching and healing work. He faced tremendous challenges throughout his life: serious health crises, financial pressures, relationship difficulties, opposition from religious authorities. But he had trained his consciousness so thoroughly in recognition that his first automatic response to any problem was to know spiritual truth. That knowing didn't always instantly change circumstances in the way he might have preferred, but it completely changed how he experienced them and how effectively he could respond. His life demonstrated that recognition prayer isn't about escaping from the world or from human experience. It's about bringing spiritual consciousness into every aspect of human experience, transforming it from within. This is practical mysticism, spirituality that works in daily life rather than requiring you to withdraw from life. The transformation that happens through consistent recognition prayer is subtle but absolutely total in its effects. You find yourself worrying less about circumstances because you're not giving them the power you once did through constant fearful attention. You experience more genuine peace because you're resting in spiritual truth rather than being tossed around by every changing appearance in your life. You become more naturally loving toward people because you're seeing beyond human personality to the spiritual reality of their being. Other people begin to notice the change in you, though they might not understand what created it or be able to name what's different. You carry a quality of presence that affects those around you in positive ways, not because you're trying to be spiritual or holy or appear enlightened, but simply because your consciousness is resting more naturally in truth more of the time. This presence becomes your unconscious gift to everyone you encounter. Most importantly, your entire relationship with God transforms completely from what it was before. God is no longer someone distant that you're trying to convince, persuade, or please through your prayers and good behavior. God becomes the ever-present reality that you're learning to recognize more consistently in every moment and situation. Prayer stops being a desperate cry for help in emergencies and becomes a joyful recognition of what already is eternally. This transformation in your relationship with God, from beggar to knower of truth, is perhaps the greatest gift of understanding effective prayer. You discover that you've never been separated from God for even a moment. You've only been unconscious of the presence that was always there. Recognition prayer awakens you to what has always been true. As you begin or deepen your practice of recognition prayer in your own life, please be patient and compassionate with yourself through the process. This is a complete reorientation of consciousness from everything you've been taught. You're unlearning decades of conditioning that taught you to believe in the ultimate power of circumstances and appearances. You're learning to see with spiritual vision, to know truth regardless of what your physical senses and logical mind report. Some days your practice will feel powerful and effective and you'll experience clear results. Other days you'll struggle with doubt and wonder if any of this is real, or if you're fooling yourself with spiritual fantasies. Both experiences are completely normal and part of the journey of transformation. The key is consistent practice over time, returning again and again to recognition regardless of how you feel or what seems to be happening in your circumstances. Joel promised his students that if you practice recognition prayer faithfully and consistently, you will absolutely see transformation in your experience. Not always in the exact timing or form you expect or want, but transformation will come. Because you're not trying to change God or manipulate reality or make something happen through spiritual techniques. You're simply aligning your consciousness with what is already eternally true in spiritual reality. And when your consciousness aligns with truth, your experience must eventually reflect that truth. This is spiritual law. It's as reliable as gravity. The question is never whether it works, but whether you'll practice it consistently enough to see the results. Give yourself time and be patient with the process. What happens when you truly understand the secret of effective prayer as Joel Goldsmith taught it? Everything changes in your life and consciousness, not because you've learned a new technique to get what you want from God, but because you've discovered that what you've been seeking has been present all along. The kingdom of heaven is within you right now. Divine perfection is already established as eternal fact. Your role is simply to recognize it and rest in that recognition. This recognition transforms how you pray, how you face challenges, how you relate to other people, how you experience your own being and identity. You stop living from lack, fear, and limitation as your foundation. You begin living from the recognition of spiritual wholeness, abundance, and harmony already present, not as something you're trying to achieve or earn or create, but as something you're learning to see and experience. Joel Goldsmith's teaching on recognition prayer is one of the most practical and powerful spiritual practices available to anyone seeking truth. It works reliably because it's based on truth, the unchanging truth that God is the only presence and power, and that spiritual perfection is already established in every situation. Your consciousness recognizing this truth is what prayer actually is at its deepest level. If your understanding of prayer has been completely transformed through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, like this video right now to share this life-changing wisdom with others, subscribe for more mystical Christian teachings that actually work in real life, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your personal commitment to this new path of recognition prayer.